This week on the It's a Monkey podcast.
And I was an advisor to the Obama administration's Office of Digital Strategy. And so I got to see firsthand how they worked. And there were a couple things. First, at a personal level, he had a curiosity and interest in it. And you saw that in his campaigns, which were very digital centric. I think he said this publicly, one of his great regrets is they weren't able to carry forward that sort of digital strategy and social strategy into the actual operations of the presidency because they had not anticipated the amount of obstacles to doing so, like the lack of flexibility in being able to do that.
Good morning, good evening, hello. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. It is Wednesday, the 8th of March, 2017, International Women's Day. So if you're an international woman, it's your day. If you're a local woman, though, out of luck, Kate.
Why is that?
It's International Women's Day.
Oh,
sorry, bit of a dad joke. Okay. Thank you for joining us. This is episode 84 of the It's a Monkey podcast. We talk about everything relating to tech, startups, entrepreneurship, all those exciting bits and pieces. And boy, do we have a fantastic guest for you coming up today. Very, very excited to say that later on in the podcast, we're going to play an interview that I did. I spoke with Anil Dash, who is the CEO of Fog Creek Software. He's also one of the first well-known bloggers. He got into blogging in pre-2000, and he's an incredibly insightful thinker about the tech industry. What I like about him, Kate, besides the fact that he's incredibly smart and incredibly articulate, he knows which questions to ask in terms of self-reflecting about our industry and the place in the world. So very excited to play that interview. It is quite a long interview, so because of that, we're going to get straight into only one news item and not do the normal post-mortem analysis to try and make it into the 1 hour. But because Anil is such a fantastic guest, I did want to let the interview run, and he was very generous with his time. As always, my co-host, Kate Frappell, design lead at ManageFlitter and soon to be Manage Social. And boy, is that looking good, but we won't tell you too much about that.
It's very exciting.
Very exciting. It's a project we've been working on for a long time. If you're interested in finding out more, go to managesocial.com. At the moment, I'm offering people, if they send a donation to their favorite charity, I'm giving them a sneak peek of that video that you did walk through. And we've had a couple of people do that already. So, for $10 to $25, send me a receipt of a donation you make to your favorite charity. We get nothing out of it except doing a little bit of good in the world. And we'll give you an exclusive sneak peek to the Manage Social product. And very few people outside of our company have actually seen it in action.
Only a handful.
Only a handful. And Evan Dunn, who's a very well-known growth marketer, I gave him a peek into it. And I just want to read you quickly what he wrote after he looked at the new system, Manage Social. I love it so much. I watched it twice. I love how the search functionality is central, foldering, organizing, and editing searches. Beautiful, gorgeous UI. Well done. So we're very pumped for that. But anyway, feel free to go to managesocial.com. Let's get straight into it. Big story over the last little while, Kate. Snapchat, or as it's known now, Snap, listed on the stock exchange. It listed to all sorts of wonderful hype. It listed at $17 and sold 200 million shares. So that means it's got $3.4 billion into its kitty. And immediately the shares bounced all the way up to
I think it was about $28 on Monday.
28, and it has since come crashing back down. So let's just talk a little bit about Snap and all their numbers and what's going on with Snap. And interestingly, comparing it to Twitter, comparing it to Google, comparing it to Facebook. So Snap or Snapchat has... as you know, it's if you're listening to the show, you've probably heard us talk a little bit about it. It was the first to provide what's called ephemeral messaging, messages that don't stick around. And when you list, you have to release a whole bunch of information about your company, which is quite interesting. What they released is that they have 158 million average daily active users as of the end of 2016, which is still a lot less than Instagram, a lot less than Twitter, a lot less than Facebook. And it was growing pretty fast up until about 2016, and then it just started plateauing. So a lot of people are saying that, well, that's a red flag. An impressive number is it got revenue up. We call it in Australia turnover. 2015 it turned over nearly $60 million for the year. Last year, though, $404 million. Huge jump. But, of course, it's making a huge loss. Just because you're bringing in money doesn't mean that you are actually making a profit. So it made a massive loss. The losses, in fact, are growing. So in $373 million in 2015 and $514 million in 2016. However, if you look at Twitter, if you look at Facebook, if you look at Google, they were all in similar positions, right? They all started out. Tech companies, you generally have to build out your infrastructure, build out your value proposition, and then find a way to monetize. Well, at least that's the Silicon Valley model. That's not the bootstrap. We had David Hannemeyer Hansen a few shows ago. His model is very different. It's bootstrapping, making money pretty quickly, making a profit pretty quickly. They're different metaphors for starting and growing a business, but this is the Silicon Valley metaphor. So they are actually losing money. And a lot of analysts say it's only really worth about $15 a share. So, yeah, look, share prices are definitely something that's in the eye of the beholder. But just to compare the market caps, which is a very interesting number. So market caps is the share price times the number of shares. And that's generally indicative of the value of a company. Facebook's market cap is nearly $400 billion, right? Huge. It's the big kid on the block. Snap's market cap at the moment and probably at the peak was about 28 billion. So you can see a huge gap between nearly 400 billion and 28 billion. And Twitter, and this is interesting, Snap was worth more than Twitter. Twitter's market cap is only $12 billion, right? Which doesn't quite make sense. Twitter's got far more significance in our society at the moment than Snapchat. What often happens with shares, you're buying into the promise of it. That's when shares become overpriced, and it's the view that you take, whether you believe that it's going to do great things, whether it's going to land up being a Facebook or a Google, or it's going to land up being something like Dig or Orkut or one of these things that a lot of people haven't even heard of. So to compare also the market cap of Google, which is the real big one on the block, Google's revenue is nearly $100 billion a year. So I'm just looking up all these stats. So it's $90 billion US. Facebook's revenue is $27 billion compared with Snapchat's revenue of eking out $500 million. So you can see why these companies, Facebook and Google, are absolutely massive. Yeah, they really, the scale of them is quite remarkable. And Google's market cap, I'll just quickly see if I can pull this up.
On that note about buying into the promise or the potential of something, a lot of the articles I've read so far, investors are primarily concerned with the high running costs and the ability for Snapchat to compete with Facebook, and the fact that everything Snapchat has done right has just been copied by Facebook, which is not a promising outlook.
And copied particularly by Instagram, which is owned by Facebook.
Yep.
Right. So I'm just looking here. So Google's market cap is $580 billion. So you can see the
giant.
They're giants. And compared to Google and Facebook, everything looks tiny. And it's, not to diminish the success of Snapchat, it's still, they've achieved huge things, but obviously compared to Facebook and Google, no one really compares. But yes, look, Snapchat's got a real big challenge on their hand. They're up against Facebook. They're up against Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. What they do have on their side is something very powerful, which is the millennials. And people love owning the millennial market because they're about to get into that sweet spot demographic, that sort of 25 to 40-year-old where people spend money. And that's where advertisers always love to market to that group of people, because they're out there, they're aspirational, they're starting to make a little bit of money, they're starting to live life a bit. And that group is where you can sell stuff to. And the millennials might be under that now, but they'll grow up and they might stay with the platform if they do the right thing, if Snapchat innovate and iterate in the right way.
Maybe. But one would argue they're also the most, I guess, the riskiest demographic.
Fickle.
Yeah, fickle. They're going to change their mind every 10 seconds, and their loyalty, I guess, can be easily bought.
Yeah, and look, it's, Snapchat could potentially buy Twitter. Twitter could buy Snapchat. Google could buy, there's a lot of these companies, and there is a lot of politics in these companies. Twitter tried to buy Instagram, and of course Instagram sold to Facebook. And Jack Dorsey apparently who was one of the founders of Twitter, was incredibly heartbroken by that. He was a very big Instagram user, and the day that deal fell through, he stopped using Instagram.
Wow.
He used it since.
And what else does he use?
He uses Twitter.
I suppose.
Yeah,
it's not the same.
Not the same. Every social media network has got its own DNA, so to speak.
But if Facebook continue copying Snapchats, or Instagram do, or they spin off another product which is even closer to Snapchat again and directly marketed at millennials, it would be interesting to see where the market stayed.
Look,
went.
As a CEO and entrepreneur, the exciting and terrifying thing about having a business is you don't know what the future holds. And there's so many factors. There's internal factors, there's external factors, there's macro factors, there's technological factors, and no one knows. Facebook almost sold to Yahoo for about $1.3 billion. It looks like an absolute bargain if they could have got it for that price. Google at some stage were trying to sell themselves for just in the millions. I can't remember exactly, and it's because these companies, no one has the foresight. No, they didn't know they were going to be, a $94 billion revenue business. And so this with Snap, well, it could go the way of a company that grows into something. Remember, companies are living, breathing things. The Snapchat today doesn't have to be the Snapchat of tomorrow and of next week.
Very true. I mean, they've changed their take as well. They're a camera company now, so they could come up with all sorts of additional products and not just rely on their app. Sure,
people love those Snapchat filters.
Yeah, the filters, but also they've got glasses now, like physical glasses that you can, I'm not sure how they work, but I'm pretty sure you can click them and it goes straight to your Snap story.
So the Snapchat of today could be something totally different. And, if you look at Facebook, the first version of Facebook didn't even have news feed, right?
Didn't it?
No. I mean,
I saw sort of like MySpace, right?
Yeah, I remember when newsfeed came out, and I remember then when they put in algorithmic newsfeed and all these changes, and you look back and you just can see all these changes that they rolled out, and when they upped their mobile version from HTML5 to a proper mobile version, and that was another. So, and this is why these companies a lot of the time do go for raising money, so you can execute out on these. This requires smart people to do all of this and resources, very hard to bootstrap, and as I mentioned, they're the two different metaphors of bootstrapping and trying to build out as you go versus having a big chunk of change and just as they say in Silicon Valley, swinging for the fences, going for it all. Anyway, we'll leave it there because we want to get to the chat with Anil Dash. We're going to take a short break and we'll come back with my chat after this, so stay with us.
Hi, this is Dave with ManageFlitter. ManageFlitter is a tool that helps you work smarter and faster on Twitter. With ManageFlitter, you can clean up and grow your Twitter account. You'll also get useful Twitter analytics, social content scheduling, and much more. Go to ManageFlitter.com and start your free trial today.
You're back with the It's a Monkey podcast. My name is Kevin Garber. I am the CEO of ManageFlitter. And on this podcast, we talk about everything relating to tech, startups, entrepreneurship, our industry. And sometimes one of my favorite things to do in the podcast is to zoom out on our industry and have a bigger picture look at what's going on. And I'm very excited to say at the end of my Skype line, I have Anil Dash, who's the CEO of Fog Creek Software. And Anil has got the great honor of once being named in a Quora answer as the Obama of Tech. Anil, thank you so much for joining us. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's a great title to have nonetheless.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, I'm not sure what it means either, but it sounds flattering, and so I will accept it as true.
Fantastic. Anil, you're based in New York, which is a little bit not unusual. There's a lot of big New York tech companies. There's Etsy. There's some of the other more fashion tech and fintech startups. Tell us a little bit about, I'm sitting in Sydney, and I'm actually looking out onto the Atlassian HQ offices, and we'll talk a little bit more about the link with the Trello and Atlassian. But, in Sydney, there's this great mythology around San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And I've been really impressed in my trips to New York the last couple of years, how New York is very quickly becoming an epicenter of tech as well.
Yeah, very much so. I had spent some time in San Francisco now more than a decade ago, 2004, 2006, somewhere in that time frame. And I liked it very much and learned a lot. But in the States where you're from, in terms of, here on the East Coast with New York and Washington, D.C. and the like, are very different than how the West Coast is perceived with San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles and those sorts of cities. And so there are substantive cultural differences. But for me, the biggest was that what I felt living in San Francisco and in the Bay Area in general was that it was almost a one industry town, or felt that way if you worked in technology. This was what everyone was paying attention to. And the example I always say to people is, I would take my dog for a walk in the evening and walk by people talking about their startup and their podcast and these sorts of things. And the contrast to here in New York, where I sort of had found a broader community to be part of, was that people could, as you had said, you look at fintech and you look at fashion and other things, but also those are just standalone industries. They might have a technology component, but for somebody to work in media and publishing, somebody to work in finance, somebody to work in fashion, somebody to work in education, they might not be concerned with what the latest trends are in the tech world at all, and only just care about them in terms of what it could do for helping them, make something interesting or create something in the world. And that was immensely appealing to me, especially because I think it led to a bit of a social conscience or a civic mindedness to the technology community here in New York that I didn't find in San Francisco.
There's definitely in New York. There's definitely in New York, you feel like you a New Yorker first and everything else second. And in San Francisco, sometimes, as much as people are very community minded, sometimes it feels like it's epicenter of technology first and everything else second, right?
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I think it's also to some degree. I had a friend years ago say, all of San Francisco tech, or the Silicon Valley, is sort of one company that has different divisions that are called Google and Facebook and whatever else. And that does feel true. People sort of change seats within that arrangement, but they don't get outside of it. Whereas I know so many people that I work with, even I think of on our team at Fog Creek, where I joined a few months ago, and people are former school teachers and people that have worked in construction and like any manner of different, completely different industries, not I was in one technology company and then another.
When I was in San Francisco, one of my first trips, I was not used to the fact of that technology saturation, and I had an older cab driver who also happens to be female, and she asked me what I did, and I said I have a product that works with Twitter, and she then threw out to me, what do you think of the latest Twitter API changes? And I sort of had to do a double take, and I was like, okay, yeah, well, that's thanks for pointing out that I'm making assumptions about your level of depth of tech understanding. So that really made me smile.
Yeah. I think that epitomizes exactly the cultural thing there. Well, at some level, that's fascinating, and it does for people who are entrepreneurs reinforce that idea that you're the center of the world, right? If even the cab driver cares what you're talking about, and they have an opinion about the change to OAuth and the streaming API from Twitter, those types of things, then you say, well, it must be critically important what we're doing if all these people are paying attention. And I think, depending on how healthy your sense of self is and your perspective on things, you may or may not be taken in by that. But I think that's something that in the long run is actually very dangerous, is to have that much of a reverence for an industry that is still so young and still figuring its way into the world and still making a lot of mistakes.
Well, one of the great things about San Francisco is they do talk a lot about, our industry is about changing the world. And you've spoken a lot recently about how our own industry, that being the tech industry, has to self-regulate. We have to also hold each other accountable and also set the bar higher in terms of, that we're not setting the bar high enough, maybe perhaps in terms of, putting more than lip service to changing the world, and actually really self-reflecting if it's more than if it's just we intend to change the world and make it better, or we're actually investing real resources into our intentions, and it's more than just a statement.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's a big concern for me, and I don't say it as anything accusatory toward others. I just sort of reflect on mistakes or shortcomings of my own, where I thought, well, our intentions are good, and therefore our results and our outcomes will be good. And as you get older and more experienced, and I've been in this industry 20 years or so now, you realize, yeah, you can mean well, but that doesn't mean that the system you designed, the technology you created, or the community that you created necessarily has only positive impacts. Even if some of them are good, that doesn't mean everything overall is good. And that took a long time to learn and to really accept, because I think for so long, I at least, and maybe others, had envisioned, well, the only way something bad would happen is if you have some sort of villain, that's twirling their mustache and thinking, let me do something bad in the world,
Sure.
And that's seldom the case. I think it's much more often that we create something. The example I would use, I built blogging software and content management systems and social media platforms for many years, some of the early tools. And, we were always very, very invested and passionate in the idea of giving people a voice. And I still feel that way. I think that was, one of the most meaningful things we were able to do was to help make the tools that people use to launch, the Huffington Post and Gawker and countless, literally millions of other sites. And so that was something that I was very proud of. And we would sort of very proudly look at, these two people were having a conversation in the comments one day, and they met each other and they fell in love and they got married. And that's what our platform enables people to do, connect around their ideas and form a real connection and all these other good things. And then, as time went on and we started to see, oh, well, these people are being quite awful to each other in the comments and stifling conversation by being abusive and harassing and all the other things that I think and pretty much everyone on the internet knows about now. We pointed those things out or had them pointed out to us. And then we're like, well, that's not our fault. The technology is neutral. People can use them in different ways. It's not, it's not anybody on our team's responsibility to fix it if people act like jerks.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I didn't connect the dots for a long time to say, well, I can't take credit for the good things and say our technology enabled that, while completely ignoring the bad things and saying it's not our fault, and who could possibly blame us for these people acting this way.
I mean, is it also because our industry is essentially technical people? I mean, a lot of the products that were built, whether it's Facebook or Google, or they were engineers that they got into it for the love of solving technical problems initially, at least, and that's in a way that the DNA that has that our industry comes from.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think, and part of this is going back to those days, even before I moved out to San Francisco, we used to have conferences in, 2002 about what was called social software, right? And nowadays we would call it, social networking or apps or whatever. It was sort of figuring out what this realm was going to be. And the only language and context we had for it was what we had all sort of been introduced to technology through, which was the conventional software industry, which was even then still mostly packaged software. You would buy a copy of Microsoft Office or Photoshop or something on a DVD-ROM or CD-ROM, or I'm old enough that we had floppy disks, and that the software was for lack of a better term, a single-player experience. Right? You had it on your device, and you would create something, and that was how it worked. And so the understanding of what software was a tool that you use in the way that a carpenter uses their saw and their hammer. And what it took a very long time to realize was when we made network systems that were very large scale, some of the first open platforms that have 1 million users on them. I helped work on sites like LiveJournal. And it wasn't just software that happens to have a network behind it. It was different in kind. It was a community, and it was almost a place, and it had to reflect all of the cultural obligations and social obligations and just even social norms, right? The behaviors and things that you would expect with a very large human community. And all of a sudden, I think it took us a long time to realize this has nothing to do with whether we're fixing bugs and if we know algorithms and whether we're adept at these technical considerations like managing memory or how a server performs. This is much more about how do people act in large groups, and do we have the background in anthropology and sociology and behavioral sciences and even ethics training to be able to act responsibly as stewards of a community that has millions of people in it. And that was a very, very different mandate than what we thought we were doing when we set out to build some pretty icons for our little app.
And what concerns me is that on so many levels, we are not having conversations around the ethics of the technology that we're creating and tech's place in the world. I saw a video earlier this week. You probably saw it. I think the company is a Boston company. Is it Boston Dynamics, that robotics company? Yeah. And they released that video of that, robot just with the dexterity and leaping over things and running over things. And of course, what first comes to mind is if that thing holds a gun, right? What's capable. And, we don't have to get into the whole Trump politics side of things, but the one area that I wish whoever is leading starts having a discussion around technology, automation, AI, robotics. I don't think that most people, or even the people in the upper echelons of the executive, realize that this wave of change that's coming that we're just not quite ready for, and we have no idea how it's going to impact us.
Not at all. And the thing is, I think the people creating these technologies who are, in the Googles and Facebooks of the world and Boston Dynamics, which I think.
That's right. Boston Dynamics, right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they were owned by Google. I don't know if they still are, but they are struggling with the ethics of this. So then to think of an ordinary politician, especially, at the local level, at a city level, municipal level, having the fluency and the literacy to make intelligent policy decisions about these things when even the people who create them barely can is unlikely to the point of absurdity, right? And so you think about, this is a conversation we're going to have be able to have across many different disciplines and many different areas of society. And yet that's not happening. We don't have large conversations about this here in New York City, where our police department has unfortunately a very long track record of excesses and abuses and kinds of biases. We're in the process. One of our city council members proposed a policy of civilian oversight of which surveillance technologies are deployed. To my mind, seems eminently reasonable. I mean, this is just a basic, and any policing system should respond to the citizens that it serves. And the proposal is actually fairly modest. It was that civilians would have oversight into things like which camera systems were used, how data was retained. Some of these new social media and surveillance tracking systems and other technologies would have a way for people in the community to be able to look at them and make a decision in collaboration with the police. And and then this was, I thought, a very modest, reasonable, measured proposal. Mm-hmm. And the immediate response from person in charge of communications at the New York Police Department was this would empower and embolden Al Qaeda if we were to take these steps towards having a measured approach in how we deploy technology. And the extraordinary thing about that, I mean, one, I sort of, I was like, at this point, an Al Qaeda reference feels very dated compared to even ISIS. and it's
very loaded as well in any case.
Right. Well, and it's so one, it's just the sort of the anachronism of that, and two, the completely wildly intellectually irresponsible part of that too, which is to say, there has never been any scenario in which these technologies were related to anything remotely having to do with that kind of extremist terrorism or anything else. So obviously this was something where they couldn't even have a reasonable response. They just took it well out of the realm of any kind of reasonable conversation. And so I think about this and I sort of despair at, well, how can we even, if that's the kind of almost like beyond parody level of response to this, how are we going to have a conversation about whether the way that we're maintaining records of video cameras is respecting of people's sort of privacy and civil rights? Like, I think we are, so far from even being able to have a grown-up adult conversation about that I think a lot of it is going to devolve to what we as technologists create, because we can, as it turns out, preempt that entire conversation simply by building the right ethical choices into the platforms as we invent them.
So why is there no push from the tech industry? I mean, it would be easy enough. I mean, if Trump can get, all of them sitting around a table, why there's no push from Facebook and Twitter and even, I mean, you're the CEO at the moment of a significant company. Why is there no push to sit around in a room and go, right, let's create a lobby group, a something that we can sort of, talk about these issues and present a paper around some thinking. And why is that not happening? It does actually seem quite ridiculous that's not taking place.
So it took me a long time to sort of think about what an answer to this could be, because I felt, I think sometimes you feel like you're sort of in the madhouse where you're like, does everyone see this thing that I see? And what I came to realize is, for some of the bigger companies in Silicon Valley, the position that the technologies we create are neutral and it's not our fault how people use them or misuse them is a very intentional political choice.
Is it also a commercial choice as well?
Yes, exactly. And so what I had thought was merely ignorance or a lack of forethought on their part, I've come to understand as a tactic, because if you position your technologies as being completely neutral, then any sort of misuse of it is not your liability. And that happens in a small way, right? So not that it's minor, but the sort of like things like the harassment on social networks, something like that is sort of a first step. And then the bigger steps are, you think about, well, entire industries are being disrupted. So we have our truck or our lorry drivers that drive the tractor trailers, what we call the big rigs. And there are millions of those drivers here in the States. And they'll be replaced by self-driving trucks, if I had to guess, probably in the next 5 to 10 years, very quickly. And so you're talking about massive economic displacement.
It's the biggest employer in the world, transport.
Yeah. And the most expensive parts of it are the most expensive because they are well-paid labor for people that otherwise wouldn't really have a skilled job to be able to take in its place. So incredibly essential to the communities that they serve. They're the sort of the highest earners in the communities that they work in. So when, not if, when this transition comes to these self-driving trucks, it is going to be incredibly dramatic and very stressful for these communities to reckon with.
Well, of course, we had a bit of a use case, right, when Uber came along and it disrupted the taxi industry, and there were people in Paris, France burning it, and etc. So I mean that's certainly a taste of what's to come. And taxi drivers in most countries are driving taxis because they don't have much of a choice to earn a living wage, anything else. So as you mentioned, the truckers don't always have a choice, and if they suddenly disappear, there could be and in a way rightly so, a backlash. And in my opinion, this is where the role of government should be to smooth out these bumps, right?
That's exactly right. And so, one, we have a bigger problem in the States where obviously even that idea that that's the role of government is a big point of contention, apparently.
Sure.
And the most radical opposition to that are people based in Silicon Valley. They have the Peter Thiels of the world have a very view.
But in fairness, Peter Thiel doesn't represent the typical Silicon Valley view, though.
No, I don't think he does at all. But I think the problem is that that's who has an outsized influence. And I think if you look at Peter Thiel, if you look at Travis Kalanick from Uber, they are not typical in terms of the politics of most of the founders or funders in Silicon Valley, but they are the ones of the most influence, right? Like sure. Right now, everyone is trying to make Uber for whatever you can imagine, right? And so whatever Uber does is seen as a model. And anyway, the end of that thought is, by positioning themselves as neutral and saying the technology is neutral and denying essentially that technology has ethics built into it, they avoid becoming culpable for this amazing change, this dramatic change, and any associated unrest that comes as a result of it. And understanding that, I think, took me a long time. I was sort of perhaps willfully naive, thinking, oh, no, they really want what's best. When you realize is they're sort of, they would rather not have to be concerned.
You can understand why, though, the contentious nature and the grey areas and where do you draw the lines. And it's, I think it would almost be great is that if every technology company, whether it's a gun and ammunition company or even a tech startup at a certain market cap or revenue, has to have a representative on some ethics think tank, and we can thrash out these issues and find that area of compromise of that we can find this pathway forward.
That's right. And I think they would if the regulators and the legislators and the politicians knew what was happening. But they, the people in office, at our national level, our members of Congress, we have 635 of them, and there may be 6 of them that know how to install an app on a smartphone out of that entire cohort.
Is it that extreme, really?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. They're wildly out of touch. They're not, slightly illiterate. When you talk about the sharing economy and Uber and, Airbnb or whatever the other exemplars are of it, they've never seen them.
Things like the blockchain, you're not even going to attempt to.
Right, exactly, right. So this thing that we find as technologists somewhat complicated and abstract and took us a little bit of time to understand is inconceivable to them. And so when you look at why are there problems around net neutrality, and we can sort of casually as technologists say, oh, well, these are the layers of the stack, and this is the layer you want to have innovation happen at the application layer, and not be locked down at the transport layer and whatever things. That's like I said, so far beyond the realm of what kind of conversation they can have of their literacy in these things. And I've spent it, this was, for many years, I worked in policy. I created a nonprofit organization, a non-government organization here that was designed to drive public engagement with policymakers through social networks. And so spent a good bit of time talking to policymakers and even elected officials here. And, there were some that were of very good intent, but the level of fluency in the technologies was shockingly low. There's a thing I always use as an example, and I think this actually, even Trump had done this when referring to his 10-year-old son, where we would have nationally elected officials, very, very prominent people, considered cultural leaders, and they would sort of just say casually, yeah, I don't know anything about technology. I always just rely on my nephew to tell me how the internet works. And you think about if you were a regulator in charge of the banking industry, the finance industry, and said, well, I've never had a bank account and I don't know anything about economics, but I asked my cousin. You would think it would be so obviously irresponsible they would be ashamed.
What was Obama like, though? I mean, he had signs that he had some sense of the lay of the land.
A couple things. And I was an advisor to the Obama administration's Office of Digital Strategy, and so I got to see firsthand how they worked. And there were a couple things. First, at a personal level, he had a curiosity and interest in it, and you saw that in his campaigns, which were very digital centric. I think he said this publicly. One of his great regrets is they weren't able to carry forward that sort of digital strategy and social strategy into the actual operations of the presidency because they had not anticipated the amount of obstacles to doing so, like the lack of flexibility in being able to do that. And the example I always go to is when I first started working with the White House on social media engagement, their team was using Internet Explorer 6 in the White House and were blocked from accessing Facebook.
The famous Internet Explorer 6, right?
Exactly.
Known as the buggiest version, right?
Exactly. And so, there was no chance that they could have been good at it. And then, of course, they changed things as quickly as they could and eventually ended up creating the U.S. Digital Service and other sort of national level projects that were bringing in very, very qualified technologists, one of whom the last head of the Office of Digital Strategy, the Chief Digital Officer of the United States, was Jason Goldman, who had been
of course from Twitter, right?
Exactly, one of the seminal figures in Twitter and blogger, and helped found Medium. So incredibly literate in these things, and that leap to go from essentially no digital function to having somebody who's as hands-on with having created modern social media as almost anyone, I think it showed what they could be, and so that's very, very impressive. But what you come back to is they were putting in process all the ability to have you still can actually do this. I don't know if the Trump administration is going to keep it running, but they have a Facebook Messenger bot where you could at that point write a letter to President Obama through Facebook Messenger, and they would get a response and it would be read. And he read 10 letters from citizens every day or from Americans every day. And one of them would come in through Facebook each day. And so, that was the kind of thing that was possible. And so you start to imagine there was this literacy. And by the end of it, they had an iOS and Android app that did a augmented reality history of the White House when you pointed it at our dollar bill, the currency. So like they had gone all the way forward into cutting edge. And that's, of course, all been walked back. And as I said, we now have, and Trump has said this, he knows all about the cyber because his 10-year-old is good at computers. It's a ludicrous kind of state of affairs.
Well, I think it's a ludicrous state of affairs because, he came in on a mandate from the middle class in a way, and the middle class is at threat from this automation the most, right? Even jobs like lawyers and accountants, and as we mentioned, transport people, and they ride in the firing line of all this radical change that's about to just sweep on through.
Yeah, and I think that's something. I do think there definitely is a cross-class boundary where one of the interesting things, and I don't want to dwell on the political part too much, but a lot of the rhetoric was about, we're losing jobs. The narrative he created was that it's to China or to Mexico or something. And of course, what the figures show, the facts show, is that it's actually to automation, right? And so, and of course, in a world where Amazon's already doing delivery by drone, that's not going to be improving. And then to the point that you point out of the lawyers and the accountants and those things, that I think that is more of an offshoring, outsourcing concern, because the immediacy of communications will allow companies to take those roles probably to cheaper markets like China and India and the Philippines and other areas. And I think, but that's there's sort of two parts to that, right? And I think that the fact that they can't even have that conversation in a nuanced way is something that I think tech is using to hide under so that we don't get the finger pointed at us either.
But even the accounting and the lawyer, I mean, the machine learning and the AI, I mean, I wasn't even referring to the offshoring side of things. I was even just referring to the AI and machine learning of being able to, and the bots where you can just, have a chat with them and then they whack out the contract for you and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, you think of something like accounting where tax code is a knowable, encodable thing. It's called code for a reason. And so being able to imagine an AI that learns at the very least what looks like you've done the accounting correctly and flag the right things, that seems eminently doable. The reason I point out the offshoring first followed by the complete automation is this two-step process, the two-stage process of essentially dismantling an industry and taking the labor out of an industry is a pattern that keeps repeating. And so Uber, the step one is take people out of the ordinary taxi system, the ordinary cab system, and have them be dispatched entirely through the Uber app. And of course, the promise to the drivers is, the old taxi system is corrupt and this is more predictable, and maybe you'll make a little bit more money up front in the beginning. And then, of course, the second step is self-driving cars, right? And we'll see the same thing with firms that today are saying, let's move our, accounting to this sort of cloud-based service. And I was in New Zealand recently and got to talk to some of the Xero folks, and their product is very good. But you can imagine the step one, outsource your accounting to them, and two, have that all be replaced by AI as well, right? And so this two-step process by which you sort of first centralize and optimize a market, and then two, completely automate it is going to keep repeating.
Anil, let's chat. I know it's getting late to your time in New York. Let's just let's just talk about your real world side of things. Yeah, you were named CEO of Fog Creek Software. Now, some people might not be familiar with actually that brand, Fog Creek Software, but that was created initially by Joel Spolsky, who started the first product, Fog Bugs, and then of course the very well known Stack Overflow, and then the even better known Trello. And now there's something that you guys are involved with called GoMix. Fog Creek has taken a slightly unusual approach in this federated approach. Again, back to the Silicon Valley model of co-founders, one product, one brand, go big on it. And they don't quite like this federated approach of sort of don't put all your eggs in one basket type thing. And you guys seemed to have made some success out of it.
Yeah, this is really a fundamentally different thing. So Fog Creek Software was co-founded by Joel Spolsky and Michael Pryor, both of whom are still good friends of mine. And I was, a fan. I feel a bit like the the person who sort of comes up singing, with the hairbrush in the mirror, singing along to a song, and then gets invited to join the band a little bit, and so that's been just extraordinarily exciting for me. And so I had been, I think, as many of us that were around at the turn of the century in the tech industry, reading Joel's blog, Joel on Software. And Joel Spolsky was the sort of one of the first voices really talking about tech culture broadly, but also how to be a good programmer and how to make good software and how to build a team.
Yeah, and importantly, how to hire and manage developers. And I say
Yes.
regularly, many of his phrases, like when we're hiring, we're looking for someone who's smart and gets shit done, right? And
yes, yeah. And it's so true. I mean, that was, and this is the thing, is to sit in the seat of the man who wrote that and then be hiring at a company, is a heavy weight. And it's exciting, but it's a bit the sort of like, wow, what am I doing here? Because I wouldn't have at the time. I remember at the time reading what Joel was writing in 2000, 2001 and said, wow, I would never pass that test. And so, that's something that I thought a lot about. But because the company was constructed that way, which is, and this is still something I think about literally every day, we hire people who are talented, motivated, and genuinely empathetic and thoughtful, and then sort of empower them to be able to create. And so, and the first thing they did is they made FogBugs, which is still our flagship product. And it is the product that invented modern bug tracking and issue tracking. Right. And so that's something that I think is an incredible legacy. And then a couple years later, the team said, what would be a simpler way to take just the one immediate problem that every programmer has around answering the questions that we have and not have the barriers that are sort of on the other sites that were on the web at the time. And they teamed up with Jeff Atwood and they built Stack Overflow. And I'm on the board of Stack, and that was actually when I started really working regularly with Joel.
And Joel's CEO of Stack Overflow, right?
That's right. And then Stack spun out on its own. So Joel is CEO of Stack Overflow. It's a standalone company. They've got hundreds of employees, an absolutely incredible business around recruiting talent. And really it was taking these ideas about how you respect programmers and how you respect people as individuals and creating a technology company and building them into the very business model of what Stack Overflow is. I loved that sense of you carrying the values through, all the way through into what the product is and how people help each other. And even little things like every bit of content that anybody's ever answered on Stack Overflow, they own the intellectual property rights to. So it's licensed to the site. But if you want to take everything you've ever answered, every question you've ever answered on Stack Overflow and make a book of your own, you don't have to even get permission. You can just go and do it. There's an API, you can download all your stuff and you can do that.
And that's very different to a lot of other content type sites.
That's exactly right.
Once it's on there, it's theirs, right?
Yeah. And so that was something that was really important, was the sort of thoughtfulness. I had been on the Stack board and, would go, initially they worked out of the Fog Creek office. And so I would go and visit. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful office. And they have these great lunches and this incredible view of the, of the New York City skyline from, we're all the way downtown in New York City, and you can go out and literally see the Statue of Liberty where we eat lunch. And now working at that company, to be able to sit there is just absolutely incredible. And so I'd see it. And then, one of the times he said, well, Michael's got this thing that we came up with and he wants to show you. And long story short, it was Trello. And
I was actually at the TechCrunch when it launched. I was at
TechCrunch. That TechCrunch just dropped, and I think it was a week before that in New York I'd gotten to see what they were going to demo at TechCrunch. So they're like, we're going to go out to San Francisco and we're going to show this thing off. And I thought, wow, this is really good. This
is really polished, really slick from the get-go, right?
Yeah. I mean, they had done the work, and the interesting thing about it was no outside investment. They had built it on their own and their team. And their team had built other things along the way. There was a screen sharing tool and some other things that they had built that were also, each of them sort of successful for a time. They made a blogging app that was successful for a time. And then also they sort of let them run their course. Like they didn't try to drag it out when one of them said, okay, we don't need to be making a blogging app anymore. That's sort of solved. Then they would shut it down. And so they said, we're looking for our next project to make. They made Trello. They realized they had gotten it right, I think, almost immediately. And they went all in on launching it at TechCrunch and building this great product. It's funny. That's the only angel investment I've ever done, as it were. They said, would you want to, we think we're going to get a little bit of funding so we can make it its own company and start to grow it. Because it's funny because they didn't do that until it literally had millions of users. They did it on their own inside Fog Creek. It got to a couple million users, and they thought, oh, well, we should get some more resources so we can sort of
wanted to double down on it.
Yeah, exactly. And at that point, I said, yeah, I would love to be an angel investor in this. And still to this day is the only time I've ever done that in my life. But it was so obviously a great tool that people would love. And then that spun out on its own. But I think there's a really unique and surprising thing that happened that I don't think most of the people in the world know, which is Trello spun off of Fog Creek and became its own company. Michael became the CEO of that. So the other co-founder went to run that. And yet to this day, Fog Creek and Trello still share an office. Our headquarters in New York is both teams together. We have lunch together. We have a single table that everybody sits around, that holds 40 people on a long table. We bring in lunch every day, these really wonderful catered lunches with window behind us, the view of the Statue of Liberty and all the rest, and sit around and talk through what we're doing on products and what's going on in people's lives and who had a birthday and, all the sort of usual things. And that's true today. And that's something that I think no other company can do. And in fact, we regularly have people from Stack come by the office. I go over there, for board meetings or to talk to their marketing team. And so there's a connection between these companies around these values, around, this set of principles about how we treat people and what the ways are that we work, even to the point of, Joel wrote a blog post in 2001 that said, it was called the Joel test. And it was, these sort of rules about how to make software. And some were very prosaic, make sure you have a version control system and things. But that was, half a decade before GitHub existed. So there was still a radical thing to say. And even a simpler point of, every programmer should have an office with a door that closes so they can concentrate.
And I remember he said, if I can do this in New York, the most expensive real estate in the world, wherever you are in the world, you can do that too. I remember reading that.
Yes,
he said, there's no excuses.
And to this day, we do it 100%, and the only thing that's changed since then is we do allow remote workers now, but we give everybody the tools they need at home too. We sort of tell them we'll get you the noise canceling headphones and the adjustable desk if you want a standing desk, and we'll get you all the kit, all the gear you need to go and do it. And that's still something that we hold the line on all these years later. And I said to Joel the other day, I only wish he had said on his list, don't illegally collude with your biggest competitor in order to depress the wages of your workers, as Google and Apple did. If he had put that on the list alongside to have a nice lunch and have an office with a nice desk, I think maybe that would have helped. But
what are his thoughts about remote work? I mean, there seem to be two schools of thought. There's the Marissa Mayer, no remote work, all come in, and then there's this other school of thought, which is Basecamp, where our industry lends itself so well to it, and there's a lot of advantages.
I think there are strengths to both, and it depends on what you're trying to do. I think to the point, and I had a little bit of a window. I used to have a strategy consulting firm, and my co-founder was on the board of Yahoo and helped recruit Marissa. So I got a window into her joining at Yahoo. And what I saw was they were a company at a point of reckoning, and one that had not had a lot of innovation or a lot of output in a long time. And I think if you're going to be in, call it crunch mode or focused mode or whatever it is, it does make sense, especially if you already have the offices to use, to have everybody in the same place and that sort of, we're in this together kind of
bit of a war room type.
Exactly. That was my strong sense of it. I don't think she was saying nobody can ever be remote again. I think it was.
We got a lot of work to do. We just want to keep things simple, not introduce any more variables. Let's just get on with it.
And I think it was a company culture where, if there's the worst case you could have is people that are disconnected, have no sense of urgency, and they're remote, right? Because then they're just sort of floating in space and people become very unhappy. I think, people need a purpose and a sense of connection and meaningfulness to what they're doing to be satisfied in their work. And already hard with remote, even if you are doing a great job. So I think that's sort of one part to it. I think, and I've always looked to Basecamp, and I still think of them as 37 Signals, but I always look to David and Jason and Basecamp and other similar companies that I learned a lot from about how to run a company. And, I'm pro-remote. I mean, 2/3 of Fog Creek is remote employees now.
Okay.
And that, I would say 5 years ago, it was, 5%.
What's the time zone spread of those 2/3?
It's not as big as I probably would like it to be. We have one of our folks in the UK, and then every US time zone, which is 3. And then one of the team members in Mexico, I think, is one further time zone over. So it's about, in terms of hours, it's about 8 hours.
That's
so
something we struggle with being in Australia. We try
Yeah.
and push towards some of the remote workers, and of course, Australia's in the time zone of no one. So
Yeah, it's quite hard. We'd had when I used to make the work on the blogging tools, Movable Type and TypePad, and they were sort of the early content management systems. And we had our biggest office. I was in San Francisco at the time. The second biggest office was in Japan. It was in Tokyo.
Right, similar story.
Yeah, and that was very hard. And then I moved back to New York while still working at that company. That was incredibly hard. So, it was
it's literally the opposite time zone.
Yeah. You're completely offset from Japan, but then to be able to find a common time between Japan and Tokyo, New York, and San Francisco is pretty much impossible.
It's like when I'm in New York, I feel like I'm working day and night. I do the two shifts, the New York shift and the Sydney shift, and they are the opposite ends. Yeah.
And I see that now where, the end of the sort of the Trello story is about I guess it's been about a month or 6 weeks or so. Trello as an independent company sold to Atlassian.
Now, Atlassian must have really wanted them, right? And which is great for you guys, but Atlassian paid a lot of money for that, and they didn't even have that cash on their balance sheet, so they're obviously funding it by some other instruments or so. But they must have been incredibly hungry for that product because they saw that ultimately it would have been a significant competitor to Jira.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because in the very early days of Jira, Jira and FogBugs were the sort of two market leaders. It's an interesting thing to have watched. I mean, we still have a very successful business with FogBugs, but obviously not on the scale of what Jira is. And there was, I think, a bit of a rivalry, which I'm not sure, but may explain why the logo of FogBugs is a kiwi, because I think that might have been a little bit of a jab. I'm not sure, but I have my suspicions. But it to that point, but it was always a friendly rivalry. I mean, I think it was sort of, these are all,
of course,
very thoughtful, good people, and I think actually very much in the manner of how Aussies and Kiwis tend to take shots at one another, and so it was something where I think there was an interesting rise of watching. Oh well, this model is working very well for Jira, and they're succeeding. And what would it look like to be the sort of new era of that? And I have to imagine, and I wasn't there at the time except to see the product, I have to imagine that was some of the inspiration for Trello, was this like, what would the new kind of thing look like, right? And so there's this, sequencing of a bit of a back and forth of let's keep it, each of us, between these companies iterating on how to solve this kind of problem. And I actually haven't had a chance to talk to Joel and Michael about this since the transaction happened, but I have to imagine there was some sense of satisfaction of these erstwhile rivals having to acknowledge that what they had made was so good, that they needed to have it as part of their company.
It's the ultimate form of flattery, right? When the student beats the teacher, that's the ultimate, right?
Yeah, and I think at the same time, I think there was also a nice sense of like that put a wonderful bookend on the sense that there was a rivalry, because now Michael, I think, reports directly to the founders of Atlassian, and and Michael still runs the Trello team, and so that's also a unique and unusual thing to have happen in the industry. I think only that grounding in the values of what they are, that we're going to sort of still hold true to them. I think without that, it would never have been able to work. And so that's something I just think is there aren't a lot of parallels to that in the industry. But the interesting thing for me in the last few weeks has been we now share our office with Atlassian New York.
Terrific. I don't think they've had a New York up until now, have they?
No. I think they had tried very, very early on.
Yep.
They're going to put their office in the States of New York, and the time zones sort of scotched that. And so they ended up going to San Francisco after a very short period of time. So this is the first time they've had a substantial presence in New York. But the interesting thing about this is, although obviously the team here is working on Trello, nominally the biggest competitor to our key product of FogBugs is Jira. And yet we are roommates with them in our cozy little office downtown. And so that's a fun, who knows how that'll resolve, but I think for now it's a really fun sort of state of affairs. And we do still have lunch with them every day.
There's times to collaborate and times to compete, and you guys are an interesting, unique situation. Tell us about GoMix.
I'm so excited about it. This is, honestly, I had talked to Michael and Joel about Fog Creek for a long time. And I was also like, I love the company, but I don't feel I'm not qualified for this, whatever. And I saw what would become GoMix, and I sort of lost it. I thought, this is the best thing I've seen. Like, I have to, whatever I can do to help this thing exist in the world. I just was so taken with it. And the short version of it is, it is a programming environment, a development environment that lives in your web browser and lives in the cloud. And
Mm-hmm.
I say that, and people say, "Oh, well, we've had text editors in the web browser before, and we've had things like very good tools like CodePen and JS Fiddle, and we've been able to edit that code. And so, how is this different to that?" And you say, "Well, we've got a lot more tools around being able to collaborate." And they say, "Oh, well, GitHub, you can kind of edit in the browser." And you say, "Well, yes, but what's happening as soon as you make a change to your code that you see in GoMix, it immediately deploys it live on the cloud as real code, because there's a complete server running behind it, running Node."
Right.
And that, the ability to do that is essentially brand new because of the advancements that have happened in containerization, virtualization, orchestration, the drop in cost of deploying those things in the cloud, the maturity of Node as a platform to be able to host that, improvements in the browsers to being able to do the real-time collaboration, all those things. Like, all that has changed so rapidly that it's only in the last maybe 18 months that you can make the system where if you go to GoMix, what you'll see is sort of looks like an app store. Here's a sample Slack bot and a sample Twitter bot and a sample whatever you want to make, an Amazon Alexa skill. You click on it and immediately it opens up the code in this full development environment. But what's happened in the back end is it's automatically spun up a brand new web server for you in the Amazon cloud, running Node and connected to this code, pulled down the latest version of the code, and has it deployed live to the web. And that's happening in about a second.
Is it almost the equivalent of like a WYSIWYG editor for
Yes,
development?
Yeah. What we keep thinking about is there are a couple things. One is I said I want it to be Google Docs for writing code,
Mm-hmm.
and I think of I'm old enough where I can't came up using Microsoft Word and track changes, and what a lot of pain that was.
Yeah.
And
Google's
now,
done a good version with their suggested edits. It's
right.
a lot better.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works quite well. And also, I mean, if I were writing a book, I would use Microsoft Word. But for any normal business document, I would rather use Google Docs. One, because it's easy and it's there and it's in my browser. But two, if I just send the link to you and you want to add some edits, it's sort of effortless. And that model, I thought of the challenge we had, in my last company. We were an open source project, and we had at some points a lot of contributors, and teaching people who were new contributors how to rebase on GitHub, and sort of make a proper pull request and review their code and do all those things, felt like using track changes in Word. And I thought, if I could just invite you into my editor, if I could just invite you in and we could edit together live, it would be a completely different experience. It would just be, well, what I'm used to and everything else. That's what I do in Google Docs. That's what I do when I'm chatting in Slack. And why can't I do that when I code?
Is your target market developers or non-developers who want to create something?
It's a little in between. What I think of a lot, and certainly for developers, what I think of is if you're a current developer, I think this is where you're going to go and do everything that you find fun. Because any other development environment, your normal, text editor on your desktop is going to feel lonely compared to GoMix. Mm-hmm. But I think there are, in the States here, I think we have about 1 million people who are working developers or programmers or coders of some kind. But I think we probably have 10 times that number who are people that, in the old days would have made a GeoCities website on their own. Today has probably, edited a WordPress blog post, the HTML, or they have made a formula in a spreadsheet. So they've got a little bit of technical skill, but the barriers to being a proper coder have been too high, especially because coders are often really rude to new developers, right? Yeah. They're very hostile to it. And so I think about what Stack Overflow did to make coding accessible to people. And that's a lot of the mission of what GoMix can do, is we say, one, be the place that 1 million working coders in the US, or I think it's 20 million coders around the world, can go and say, this is a less lonely place to do my code. And then the adjacent audience of another 50 million people who have some technical skills will be able to come in, start from a working project rather than a broken pile of pieces, and remix it and change it and tweak it into exactly what they want. And then the things that we're working on, this is sort of revealing a bit of our upcoming roadmap, is the minute they get stuck or they get an error message, be able to raise your hand and say to the entire GoMix community, can somebody come in here and help me understand what's wrong with this app so I can fix it, and maybe we can suss it out together.
Now, are they working on apps for themselves? Or are they collaborating on apps they both going to use? Or?
We're seeing a range of different things there.
Right.
One of the first communities actually that's really taken to GoMix here, especially in the States post this election, are activists. And so we have a lot of people saying, I want to build a tool to help organize my community or to respond to a social issue that I care about. And in many cases, they have, well, one, they have an immense amount of drive and motivation. Two, they have a little bit of technical skill. So they've built websites and things before, but they, and they've played a little bit with interactive code, but they sort of don't fully know how to program. And then we've found a really interesting latent audience of developers who are saying, I have this technical skill and I have a couple hours free each evening, and I wish I could put it towards a good cause, but I don't know which ones. And so what we've been doing is matchmaking in some ways and pairing those people up, and especially because they can find each other, because we've got a community where you can discover the apps that are there and remix them and see who created them, and even just ask to join if you're like, I know how to code, I'd like to help you out. That those gears are starting to turn, and that's something I think we're incredibly excited about. I mean, literally the top priority we have is to build that ability for somebody to say, I've gotten just the basic bones of this thing working, and I'd like to raise my hand and ask somebody to help me turn it into something really powerful.
So it's almost like an improved social layer across open source in a way.
Very much so. Yeah. I think what we found, and we did a bit of surveys on this, I even just sort of informally asked on Twitter, well, the phrasing I used was, what made you stop learning to code or trying to learn to code? And
good question.
Yeah. And what had happened, because I think for so many years, we'd always heard do you want to learn to code? It was even a bit of a fad where we had like the mayor here in New York City, the last mayor, Michael Bloomberg, say, I've signed up for a coding class online and this kind of thing. And I'm like, why? I don't know why he did that, but okay. And I thought the opposite, which I think many, many more people have thought, I'm going to learn to code this year. That's going to be my New Year's resolution, and then abandoned it. And what you find out is about 3/4 of the time, the fundamental reason somebody stopped learning to code is because some guy was a jerk to them.
Right. Interesting.
They asked a question on a mailing list or as a contributor to an open source project and got shut down. You don't have enough knowledge. You don't know what you're doing. We don't want you here. All those other sort of things that we hear far too often. And so, I'm old enough to remember when open source was a radical idea. We thought, okay, well, if you can just make everything open, then everybody will be able to collaborate together and we'll fix all the bugs and all the problems and we'll make great software. And what is directly parallel to all the issues we had in tech is, well, let's solve the technical issue or even the legal issue, but not the social issue about what it takes to get people to work well together. And so we look at really deeply, GoMix is this broader solution of create a social context where people are oriented towards helping one another and it's effortless to collaborate. And then the stuff that we already have in open source, the code that people have been writing for decades now, will come alive in a way that it hasn't before.
And I hope this feeds into the very important issue, which in a way is related to what we first started chatting about at the beginning of the interview, the ethics, which ties into the diversity in our industry, which is such an issue. I mean, I have a small startup and we feel the symptoms of the problem that needs to get resolved at lower down the food chain of the training and of people feeling comfortable from diverse backgrounds, feeling comfortable to go and skill themselves up and learn the hard skills of coding and engineering, so that when I'm at the opposite end, we have a pool to choose from and it gets a lot easier to create those diverse companies.
Yeah, very much so. And I think these things are directly related. What I hadn't understood for a long time is when we made tools that were thoughtless or that didn't anticipate how they would be misused or leave people behind, part of it was because our teams weren't diverse enough. If we'd had people with other perspectives, they would have anticipated those issues. The idea that the ethical failings of the industry and the diversity failings of the industry were directly connected, in retrospect, feels really obvious, but it took me a long time to learn. And so we think of this as that's one of the core missions of building this GoMix community, is that it's inclusive and friendly and welcoming from the start, because it means we will make better software in the community. And so there's a really nice thing where, a lot of what we're looking at for how to make GoMix sustainable over the long term is partnering with companies that have APIs and that have, software development kits that they want, a community to use. And oftentimes their process right now is to go to, a meetup and tell, the group there, well, we'll give you a t-shirt and will you please come to our GitHub page and download this code and maybe get it running on your laptop and then try our platform. That's a lot of work and a lot of risk and actually doesn't do a good job of getting out to people who are, not at that event in the first place. And so we think of, if instead you go to the site and they just have a button that is try this now in GoMix, like tomorrow and instantly today, you can do this. And got live running code and it's there. And then when you get stuck, you could ask for help. And maybe that company that makes the API will help you. Maybe somebody else in the community will help you. And because you're doing it at GoMix as a community where we value inclusion and you've already got diverse viewpoints and people that are there that are from a different background, and they'll help you identify what you might not have thought of when you built that software. That's a better solution for everybody. So that's a lot of what we think about, of how to grow the community, but also bring it into solving this problem, not just for our company, but across a lot of companies in the industry.
Do you code?
I do. I try not to exasperate all the other coders at our company because they're all better at it than me. And actually, that's where GoMix has been great because, this is sort of one of those eat your own dog food things. If you go to gomix.com and you see the community site, we've got, like I said, it looks like a bit like an app store, and there's sort of directory of apps. That is itself a GoMix app. So we use the tool to make the tool. And cool. And that's something that's where I get to tinker. Right. I sort of like to go in and play, and I'm not setting up the editor for people because that's sort of the thing where I'm like, I'm not a good enough coder where I would feel like what I'm doing is shippable to users. But on the community side, where it's, much more sort of design oriented, and I'm a much stronger front end developer, I can sort of have my way there a bit. And that's really fun. It's a great outlet for me. It gets me using the tool to make real production software for our company every day. That's something that I think gets right to the heart of what I understood Fog Creek to be when I first became a fan 15 years ago, and it's nice to have that connecting through into how we run day to day today.
Fantastic. Anil, I know it's getting late there. I believe you in one of my favorite parts of Manhattan. You're on the Lower East Side, East Village.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
One of my favorite parts on that wonderful part of the world. Maybe on my next trip, I'd love to catch up. But
I'd love to host you here. Would love to have you come by Fog Creek as well.
I'd love to see those great offices, and really appreciate your time on the podcast. We've been talking to Anil Dash, who's the CEO of Fog Creek Software and a well-known blogger and tweeter, and we'll put links to all his bits and pieces on our show notes. And thanks so much for joining us.
Cheers. Thanks so much for having me on.